Okay, good evening, everybody. You're welcome to this smart tutorial class. And today we are going to look at, we want to study homeostasis. And this is going to be a series. So we'll start our first class in homeostasis. Now we know that mammals, including human beings, there's a way that we can regulate our internal environment. So the ability of organisms to regulate their internal environment is what homeostasis is all about. Is that okay? So this is the objective in this first class. By the end of this lesson, students should be able to explain the importance of homeostasis and explain the negative feedback mechanism. These are the two objectives that we tend to achieve in this short video, homeostasis. Is that okay? Now, introduction. To function efficiently, organisms have control systems to keep internal conditions near constant. And this is what we call homeostasis, the ability of organisms to maintain a fairly constant internal environment. Now, this requires information about conditions inside the body and the surrounding, which are dictated by the sensory cells. If there's a rise in temperature, if there's a rise in temperature, the sensory cells will dictate it. The sensory cells will dictate it. So these sensory cells plays an integral aspect of homeostasis. Any factor that can cause a response in an organism is what we call a stimulus. So the sensory cells are cells that can dictate, they can pick this stimulus. It can be a rise in temperature. It can be a rise in the blood glucose level. When it rises, sensory cells pick it. Okay? So the sensory cells are parts of the homeostatic process. They are very important. Without the sensory cells, the body will be unable to dictate this stimulus that we are talking about. And some of the physiological factors controlled in homeostasis in mammals are core body temperature. The mammalian, or let me use the human for example, our body temperature is 37 degrees. So this physiological factor of temperature needs to be controlled within that range of 37 degrees. A high temperature can become problematic to the body, and a low temperature can also be problematic to the body because most of the enzymes will be inactive. Most of the enzymes will work at a slow rate. So the metabolic activity drastically reduces at low temperature. Other physiological factors are metabolic waste, blood pH, blood glucose concentration, water potential of the blood, the concentration in the blood of the respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are factors that needs to be regulated, are physiological factors that are regulated in in an organism. Is that okay? Now, the internal environment of an organism refers to the condition inside the body. What is the state? What is the state of the organism? What is the state, the condition of an organism? That is the internal environment. Now, the cell in an organism will not exist on its own. The cells exist in a fluid called the intestinal fluid or the intercellular fluid, okay, or the tissue fluid. So the cells exist in the tissue fluid. So the tissue fluid that surrounds the cell, the composition of the substances in the tissue fluid, it needs to be regulated. Now, many features of the tissue fluid influence how well the cell function. Let me use three physiological factors and how it can affect the function of the cell. The temperature. Low temperature slow down metabolic activities, and at high temperature, proteins, including enzymes, are denatured and cannot function. Then the water potential. If the water potential decreases, water may move out of the cell by osmosis, causing metabolic reaction in the cell to slow or to stop. And if the water potential increases, water may enter the cell, causing it to swell and maybe burst. So the water potential is an integral factor that needs to be regulated in water potential of the tissue fluid where the cells are found. The concentration of the glucose. Concentration of glucose is important because glucose is the respiratory substrate. What I mean by respiratory substrate is a substance that is used that is broken down, and when it is degraded, it produces energy in the cell. Now, lack of glucose in the tissue fluid will therefore mean that respiration will slow down. And as respiration slows down, it therefore also means that it's going to affect the production of energy in the cell. So low glucose level means that metabolic activity reduces. High glucose level means that too much glucose may cause water to move out of the cell by osmosis, again disturbing the metabolism of the cell. Therefore, these factors need to be balanced. If they are not balanced, it's going to cause problem to the cell. Now, homeostatic control is usually by the negative feedback mechanism. There are two types of feedback. A feedback is your response to an action. Your response to an action, that's a feedback. For example, a teacher can teach in a class, and after teaching, he will ask to get response from his learners. So that's a feedback. So in the biological world, there's also a feedback. When there is a change, when a factor or a stimulus is being dictated, how the organism will respond to it. Physiological changes, series of physiological changes will be triggered to respond to that factor. So that is a feedback. But in the biological world, the regulatory strategy or control in homeostasis is a negative feedback. We have a negative feedback and a positive feedback. In a negative feedback, a factor, let's say temperature, the temperature rises, so the body responds to it, and the response will bring about a lowering of the temperature. That is a negative feedback. A negative feedback antagonizes or counters the initial stimulus that is dictated. So if temperature rises, negative feedback will bring it down. If the temperature is low, negative feedback will increase it around that set point or value, that set value. Now, in positive feedback, when there is a response, the cell will increase that initial stimulus. Positive feedback can be dangerous to the cell. If you have cancerous growth, the cell will keep on growing. That's a positive feedback. But positive feedback is also important in birth. When a woman wants to deliver a child, then the child will try to come out, there's a contraction. So this will be dictated. The body will produce a hormone called oxytocin. This oxytocin increases the contraction, which will eventually bring about the delivering, the birthing of that child. So that's a positive feedback. Now, what am I saying? Positive feedback, if a factor increases, positive feedback will further increase that factor. Negative feedback, if a factor increases, negative feedback will decrease that factor. If the factor decreases, negative feedback will increase it. So in regulation, in homeostasis, the negative feedback that occur in homeostasis. And the key component is the receptors, which is a sensory cell, or we call it the sensor, the control center, which is the brain, and the spinal cord, specifically the hypothalamus, and the effector. The effector is what carries out the response. Okay, so this diagram is to show us a negative feedback control loop. We call it a negative feedback control loop. So here we have a factor rises above a set point, and this will be taken to the control system, and effectors will now act to decrease that factor. Now, also here we have a factor falls below a set point and the control system. So effectors will be sent to act to increase that factor. When a factor rises, effectors will be sent to what? To reduce that factor. If a factor reduces or decreases, effector will act to increase that factor. That's a negative feedback loop or negative feedback mechanism. So the components, we have a receptor that dictates changes, the stimulus, any factor, anything that needs to be controlled. Any disruption from the normal physiological state of the cell is a stimulus. It can be internal or external, like temperature, heat, temperature, pressure, okay, glucose concentration in the blood. All these are stimulus. Anything that the body responds to. The receptors send information to the central nervous system. Okay? The receptors or the sensors, they impute information. That is, they send information to the brain. So we call it the input, the impulse or input. Okay? Now, the role of the effector from the central control sends signals to an effector, which is muscle or gland. For example, if the blood sugar is high, then insulin, producing the pancreas, insulin will be produced, which will help in the conversion of this blood sugar, that is glucose, into glycogen. So you can see the effectors now. So it starts from the sensors or the receptors to the central control, that is the brain, then to the effectors. Effectors will do the final job. Sensors or receptors pick it up, and effectors do the final job. Now, the negative feedback mechanism tends to keep our internal factor near a set point, which is an ID point. Let's use temperature. Negative feedback mechanism tends to keep our temperature to 37 degrees, which is the ID value for the human temperature. So if a factor increases, negative feedback mechanism system act to reduce it. If a factor decreases, negative feedback mechanism act to reduce that factor. This is a negative feedback mechanism. In all, it keeps fluctuation around a set point. That is the idea behind the negative feedback mechanism. The homeostatic mechanism in mammals require information to be transferred between different parts of the body. Now, there are two coordination systems in mammals that do this: the nervous system and the endocrine system. In the nervous system, information in the form of electrical impulses is transmitted along the nerve cell, that's a neuron. And the endocrine system uses chemical messages called the hormones that travels in the blood in the form of long-distance cell signaling. So, in summary, today we have looked at the negative feedback, introduction to homeostasis, the negative feedback. The negative feedback is a regulatory strategy in the body that tends to what? Bring about normalcy in the body. If the temperature increases, it dictates it to bring about reduction. If the blood glucose increases, it dictates it to bring about reduction. So negative feedback mechanism is a key factor in homeostasis. In our next class, we are going to look at thermoregulation, how the cells tends to regulate the temperature. If you have any question, you can drop it in the comment section. Thank you, and God bless you.